A couple years back, my wife and I threw a Halloween party for our kids and a few of their friends. The deal was we'd entertain the kids until around 8 that evening, then they'd head off to their respective friends' houses to finish their nights off with Halloween sleepovers. But in turn, that allowed my wife and I to throw a grown-up Halloween party. It had been both our favorite holidays growing up, and since we promised to spend the holidays with my wife's side of the family, we threw the All Hallows Eve bash to spend some time with mine. It was definitely a family affair, just not quite wholesome enough to warrant having the kids in the house anyway. The party's fantastic. Everyone has a great time, and my parents had agreed to spend the night in our spare rooms so they didn't have to worry about driving or getting a cab home. That meant my father and I ended up huddled up around the fire pit at around 1 in the morning, finishing off any beer that we could find, while making each other laugh and telling each other stories. Then at some point, I asked Dad if he knew any spooky campfire stories. I wasn't seriously asking him. It was more like I asked him, sort of half-jokingly, because it was technically still Halloween night. But then, as it turned out, Dad did have a creepy story to tell me, one he'd somehow kept secret from me for almost 35 years. My dad grew up in small-town, Ohio, and he eventually moved back to Cincinnati, where he met my mom and had us kids. But for college, my dad went to UC Irvine, which is out in California, about 30 miles south of Lane. He said that he loved it out there. He knew that he wanted to come home at some point, but said his days as a beach bum are some of the most treasured memories of his youth. I knew that already, of course, but what I didn't know was that my dad used to date some smoking hot windsurfer chick that he met on Newport Beach. He said that during the summer of 1982 his buddies and him headed down to the beach to throw a ball around. When they saw this sign advertising windsurfing lessons, the two instructors were this tall, wiry, dark-haired guy, and then this absolute fox with a mess of golden blonde hair, stunning eyes, and this deep, rich tan from all her time spent in the sun. My dad said that he and his buddies found the spot for their stuff and then started to throw the football around, but all Dad did was walk off towards the windsurfing instructors and talk his way into getting a lesson from old Blondie. Dad said he hated windsurfing, but that it was a great way to get close to the instructor. And then once he was satisfied that there was mutual attraction, he asked her out, and they started dating. Dad said that she seemed wonderful at first, but that after about a month of seeing each other, he realized that she was in some weird love triangle with her roommate and some professional windsurfer that she'd met on a trip to Hawaii. My dad explained that at first, he trusted that the roommate was just that, a roommate, but over time, it became pretty obvious that they were romantically involved. Blondie told my dad that they used to have a thing together, but that they were nothing more than roommates by that time, and that he didn't have to worry. Dad said that he wanted to believe her, but by the time the professional windsurfer entered the picture, he realized what was going on. He didn't mind her dating other guys. They weren't like, official or anything like that. But what he did mind was all the duplicity. I guess she hadn't been straight upon us with him from the get-go, and that, as they say these days, was a huge red flag. I absolutely cannot picture my dad breaking up with some smoking hot beach babe. Like, I would absolutely need to see that to believe it, but either way, they'd stop seeing each other, and Dad eventually moves back to Cincy and starts what became our family. And now cut to 1994, I'm 6. My little brother is 3, and for my dad, the memory of Blondie and her weird, deceptive love triangle was a distant one. Then one day, he opened up a newspaper and there she was. He said that he didn't recognize her at first, to the point that he just thought the name was a coincidence. But nope, there was no coincidence. The woman in the newspaper was the very same one he briefly dated while in California, and her name was Dana Sue Gray. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the name, Dana Gray murdered 3 older women and early 1994 and used their credit cards to go on shopping sprees. Once she realized that there was a manhunt for her, she cut all her blonde hair off and dyed it black, but the cops still caught up with her and she was sent to prison for murder. Dad said it was obviously very shocking, that he felt deeply for the families of those affected, but that he never felt like he was ever in any danger. I guess he just didn't fit her victim profile, or whatever the cops might call it, and she obviously wasn't ready to kill by that point, because she waited 12 years to do it and killed 3 in as many months. But then what my dad said creeped him out so much was that he actually wasn't all that surprised. He was surprised Dana had killed anyone. That was definitely a shock to him, but it was the way she did it that seemed very in character, so to speak. Dad said that especially toward the end of their relationship, it became obvious that Dana simply didn't think that rules should apply to her. She seemed to have this idea that she could do whatever she wanted and then just get away with it, possibly on account of her good looks. Dad said it was scary to think that this irritating but very minor personality disorder had basically grown and grown until one day, Dana thought that she could murder old women then go on shopping trips with their credit cards, and the law just wouldn't catch up to her. It makes me think that psychological stuff like that is almost like a cancer. You either deal with it when it's small and manageable, or you let it grow and spread until one day, it's just far too late to do anything about it, and what used to be one tiny flaw has taken them over completely. In 2012, I went through a very rough breakup with my boyfriend of around 18 months. You know that old saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Well, our relationship was like that, only instead of a sword, there was a lot of drugs and alcohol. He was a party animal, and at first I found that very attractive, but after almost 2 years of fighting and struggling for money while nursing hangovers, I realized that I wanted to mellow out while he didn't want anything of the sort. I didn't want to be that lame, controlling girlfriend. I wanted him to live the kind of life that felt right. I just wasn't going to let us slowly drift apart when we'd be much happier pursuing relationship goals with alternative partners, and that's the way I saw things anyway. But he disagreed. Like I said, the breakup itself was rough. There was yelling, there was tears, but in the end, he seemed to accept my decision and agreed that we'd be happier seeing other people. I also explained that I wanted to end things on a high note, and that I didn't want my final memories of him to be tarnished by anything negative. That's what really seemed to make it through to him. And after that, everything seemed fine. But then came the night that he drove over to complete the ceremonial exchanging of stuff. I'm pretty sure that a lot of you know what I'm talking about. If you've been seeing someone long enough to have frequent sleepovers at each other's places, chances are you've left a whole bunch of stuff over there, for example, a bunch of skincare stuff to keep in his bathroom. So I didn't have to carry a makeup bag to and from his place. Then factor in that I have to buy this expensive Korean skin cream that literally has snail slime in it. Look it up and you can see why I was so desperate to get it back. Now anyway, so I've been texting my ex back and forth for a few days, organizing the exchange, making sure we're not forgetting anything. So it's a one-time thing, and we can make a clean break. He agrees to come over to my place once we both finished work. Then when I got home, I bagged up all of his stuff and waited for him to arrive. He told me that he'd be at my place by no later than 7. But then 7 turns to 7:30 and there's no sign of him. I text him to ask where he was, but got no reply. So maybe like 5 to 10 minutes later, I start calling him, and after getting his voicemail a few times, he finally picks up. He didn't sound like he was in a particularly good mood, but all that indicated to me was that he was sober. He told me that he'd gotten caught up in a few things, and that he'd be over by around 8:15. All I did was ask him not to be too late, as I had to work the next morning. He hung up, and then I went back to waiting. Finally, just before 9, he buzzes my apartment, and I let him upstairs while I waited near the door with bag of stuff. It took him slightly longer than usual to make it to my door, but then when he does, and I open it, I could smell the stink of booze on him, and right away, that gave me bad vibes. He had a shopping bag with what looked like my stuff in it, so that was a good sign, but I had also explicitly asked him to stay sober for the exchange because I knew what it might lead to. I say I knew what it might lead to, but that's not strictly true. I figured it'd get emotional. I just never have guessed that he'd take things as far as he did. So first thing I say when I open the door and smell the booze on him was a reminder that he'd promised to make the exchange sober. He just brushed it off. Asked if he could come inside, but I said, no, that I preferred just make the exchange and leave things at that. He started asking me, really, this is who you are now? And I very politely reminded him that if he couldn't conduct himself like a grown-up, then he wouldn't be getting his stuff. It was a huge bluff on my part, because I really wanted my stuff back, but I also didn't want to give him the impression that he could keep dictating terms outside of our relationship. I remember taking a step back from the door and getting ready to close it. Then, after giving him one last chance to just give me my stuff back, I attempted to gently close the door in his face. His response was to shove his foot in the door to keep it from closing, and then, after barging it open so hard, it actually frightened me, he walked down the hallway of my apartment and into the TV and kitchenette area. My apartment door was still wide open as I started yelling at him, like, "What the F do you think you're doing? Get out of here?" But he didn't listen. He just marched in my kitchenette area, where there was a small dining table, then slammed the bag of my stuff down on it. Then as he took a seat, he demanded that I come talk to him about the breakup so he could get some final closure, as he called it. I held firm, refused to even follow him into the kitchen, and kept demanding that he leave before I called the cops. But that's when he seemed to completely lose his mind and started literally screaming at the top of his lungs. "Do you want to kill me? Because that's what you're doing here. You're killing me." By the time he started freaking out and screaming, I was already on the cusp of dialing 911, but when he walked over to my knife block and pulled out the biggest one he could find, I realized things were way beyond negotiating, and hit call after tapping 911. I also rushed back towards the front door to my apartment for several different reasons. First off, I had a pepper spray in my jacket that I kept on the hanger, like out of sight in case I needed to use it on an intruder, and so the first thing I did was grab that. But now I'm outside my apartment in the hallway, with the door wide open and my ex sitting at the kitchen table. So if I need to, I can run down the hallway and out of the building and not risk trapping myself in the apartment with him. I'm also talking to the 911 operator by then too. All the while, my ex is screaming at me to get off the phone and come back inside, but since he still had that carving knife and a white knuckle grip, there was exactly 0% chance of me heading back inside. The next thing I was giving the operator the address of my apartment building. When my ex started walking toward me, out of the kitchen and into the hallway, I obviously wanted to keep out of stabbing range, so to speak. So I remember rushing down the hallway toward the elevator and stairs, then stopping to check if he was following me. My ex was following me. He'd come out of my apartment and into the hallway, but when I turned around in that split second, and he saw that he had my attention, he stopped walking, turned the knife and started to stab himself in the stomach. It looked like the knife was going deep, but not all of it went into his stomach every time he stabbed. I guess it was like lots of quick, shallow stabs, but from the horrible sound it was making, I could tell he was really hurting himself. I think that lasted maybe a second or two. I saw him doing it really, really fast. Then I just turned and ran screaming down the stairwell instead of taking the elevator. He didn't shout anything after me, or if he did, I didn't hear it. All I could hear was those grunts of pain as he stabbed himself again and again and again. Then I started screaming, and I didn't hear anything else after that. I remember taking my phone away from my ear as I ran down the stairs because it felt like I might lose my balance if I didn't, but then I was so scared that I kept trying to tell the operator what was going on, and that resulted in me running down the stairs screaming, "He's stabbing himself. He. Stabbing himself. Someone call an ambulance. He's stabbing himself." I ran all the way across the parking lot of my apartment building before bringing the phone back to my ear, and I kept talking to her as I waited by the street that I knew the cops would come down. I remember begging the operator to tell the EMTs to hurry. Lemma X was really hurting himself to the point where I thought he might die. She did her best to try and keep calm. Then the next thing I knew, I saw the cop car, and I started frantically waving at them to flag them down. One of the other things I remember is how as I let the cops into the building with my key fob, I kept telling them, "Please don't shoot him. He's trying to hurt himself, so please don't shoot him." The cops completely ignored me, I guess because they were focused on their job, but in the moment their silence had me even more panic thinking, oh God, he's still going to be holding that knife, and he's not going to drop it, and they're going to kill my ex-boyfriend right there in the hallway outside my apartment. They didn't shoot him, thankfully, he was just lying there bleeding, but by the time the EMTs arrived and got him into the ambulance, which was at least an hour after he stabbed himself, I was totally convinced that he was going to die. Thankfully, some of my neighbors had emerged from their own apartments to see what all the commotion was, and were there to give me the consolation I so direly needed in that moment. Another thing to be thankful for was that my ex survived his self-inflicted wounds, although he did need a bunch of different surgeries to repair all the damage he'd done to his stomach or intestines. I thought the whole experience might sober him up, but the last I heard he'd gone right back to his old self after maybe a year on the wagon. It's a shame, really, the guy had a lot of potential, and I wish he'd gone and made some better choices in life. But as I said earlier, if he's living the life he wants to live, then I'm happy for him. Happy to be apart from him also, but happy for him, nonetheless. Back in September of 2016, I was living just off of St. Martin's Lane in London, and one Sunday, me and a mate of mine met up at our local pub to watch the football game. Over a few pints, we watched Chelsea barely scrape a point from their match with Swansea City. And then after full time, my mate got a text from his girlfriend asking if her and a colleague could join us for drinks. About half an hour later, she turns up with your colleagues in tow. And the first thing I thought when I saw the colleague was wow. She was, without a doubt, one of the most stunningly beautiful young women I had ever laid eyes on. And from the moment I saw her, I was absolutely smitten. For the sake of the story, we'll just call her Sarah. She was half Lebanese, and right away I could tell that there was chemistry between us. Little did I know, but my mate and his girlfriend had conspired to do a bit of matchmaking, as Sarah had sent a photo of me on my mate's girlfriend's Facebook and asked her if I was single. So they were just as pleased as I was when me and Sarah swapped phone numbers and agreed to go out for a coffee sometime. One coffee date became 2, then 3, and then, before we knew it, we were going out together every weekend, and eventually decided to make things official. And things went great. At first, Sarah was a very passionate young woman, and I loved that about her, but after a while, that passion started to show its negative sides. For start, she could never, ever be wrong about anything. It could be quite cute if she was being playful with it. But about 2 months into our relationship, and she did something which wasn't so cute. So there's this TV game show in the UK called The Chase, and it became a kind of tradition to watch and play along together. We'd both finish work at around 4, and then she'd meet me at Leicester Square Tube Station, and then we'd head back to my flat to have dinner together. And since The Chase was always on at around 5 o'clock, we'd play along with it while we were eating one day, one of the questions was something like, which former Beatle first performed his song My Sweet Lord at the concert for Bangladesh in August of 1971. It then gave 4 options, which were A. John Lennon, B. Paul McCartney, C. George Harrison, or D. Edwin Starr. Traditionally, at least in the early rounds of the case, option D was always a joke answer designed to raise a chuckle among the studio audience, and on this occasion, the joke was that Edwin Starr was never actually in the Beatles. It was Ringo Starr that was in the Beatles. Edwin sang that war. What is a good for song? Now anyway, I immediately called out George Harrison, which was, of course, the correct answer. But Sarah, who was into much more contemporary music, decided the answer was John Lennon. I told her that she was possibly confusing My Sweet Lord with Imagine, and that in that case, the answer was George Harrison, but then she starts doing her I'm never wrong routine. I just carried on eating. Then when the correct answer was confirmed as being George Harrison, I said, "Told you," in the mildest, most non-confrontational way possible. I didn't rub it in her face. I didn't celebrate, I just said, "Told you," And then we carried on eating and playing along with the chase, or at least I thought we had carried on playing, because by the end of the round, Sarah's silence told me that she didn't fancy playing around anymore. I asked her if everything was all right, and instead of returning even a sarcastic reply, she completely ignored me. I asked if she was taking the end again, just completely blanked me. So I told her, if she was going to act like a child, she was free to leave any time she wanted. She then grabbed a purse and coat and slammed the door to my flat on the way out. A few hours later, and several ignored phone calls later, she finally replies to my text telling me how horrible and arrogant I had been, how I had made her feel small and stupid, and how I owed her an apology. I had no intention whatsoever making her feel that way, but when I told her as much, she broke down in tears and started apologizing over and over. She said she was stressed out at work, that her auntie back in Beirut was sick, and that it had all just gotten the better of her in the moment. I forgave her. We kissed and made up, and then that was that. Only that wasn't that, as there were dozens more arguments like that in our future. I won't bore you with all the details of each individual set to we'd be here forever, and I only went over that first one to give you an idea of what I was dealing with. But over time, things got gradually worse, until we were falling out over petty little things on a weekly basis. I really liked Sarah, I honestly did. When she was at her best, she was the perfect girlfriend, but at her worst, she was an absolute nightmare. We were together 6 months, and then when the negatives started to vastly outweigh the positives, I decided I had to man up, do the right thing for both of us, and end the relationship before things graduated to the next level, i.e. meeting parents or moving in together. To use as few words as possible, the actual breakup was much like an accomplished Argentine footballer. It was messy, on the advice of my mate's girlfriend, who by that point, had apologized profusely for setting me up with Sarah. I chose to do it in a public place, but unfortunately, that didn't really help the situation. Sarah caused a massive scene. Wouldn't talk to me afterwards, and it took a week before she agreed to exchange all the stuff that we left in each other's flats. We made the exchange, and that time, she did make a scene, but to say that she was frosty with me would be the understatement of the century. She acted like she despised me, so much so that I was worried that she might have snipped up my underwear with a pair of scissors and then used the same pair to scratch my DVDs. Thankfully, she had been mature enough to do neither, and I was thoroughly relieved that it could finally close what had been a rather grim chapter of my life. Now fast forward to July of 2017, Sarah and I hadn't spoken in months. I deleted her number, and we weren't connected on any kind of social media anymore. It was a completely no-contact breakup, but she was still on my mind a little bit. I was seeing this new girl, and I'd be lying if I said Sarah hadn't made me a little bit paranoid that this girl would also eventually show her true colors. We'd been on a few dates, but we were taking things casually, and it wasn't until after the third date at a wine bar that we kissed for the first time. I got the tube home feeling wine drunk and rather good about myself. Then after a flirty text exchange and what should have been a cold shower, I turned in for the night. The next thing I know, I'm opening my eyes in my dark bedroom with this distinct feeling of dread tightening my chest. I can't even really explain how I knew someone was there, but I did, and perhaps it was the gentle creak of my bedroom door opening or the subtle feeling of my mattress sinking as they sat down in the bed next to me. Either way, I awoke to this instant feeling of vulnerability, ability and terror. I knew how I was, and I'm not exactly proud of it, but my first instinct was to roll over, to quite literally beg whoever it was not to hurt me. I spun over in bed, adrenaline pumping, expecting to see some masked burglar or, God forbid, some kind of knife-wielding lunatic, but I didn't see some balaclava-covered face or the wild eyes of some crazed spree killer. Instead, I saw her, Sarah. I should expect some of you to think that I'd be relieved to see my ex-girlfriend in place of some armed psychopath, but for a split second, I was absolutely convinced that she was there to kill me. I remember saying, "Sarah, don't," as I slid off the opposite side of the bed from her and tried to put some distance between us. But instead of doing anything rash, Sarah simply said, "I'm sorry," and then repeated herself as she got up, walked out of my room and continued out of my flat. I stood there for a few seconds, panting like the devil, wearing nothing but my underwear and contemplating just how close I'd come to getting murdered. As I said, I didn't have Sarah's contact details by that point, and I couldn't find any of her social media accounts, so I assumed that she'd blocked me on all of them. So instead of reaching out to her directly, I asked my mate's girlfriend to pass a message on for me, basically saying that if she came near me again, I'd be getting in touch with the police. I would have preferred to have kept it between us. I really would have. I didn't want to air out my own dirty laundry in public, let alone anyone else's yet. As I'm sure you'll agree, Sarah didn't leave me much of a choice on that front. It sparked a great deal of curiosity among my mate and his girlfriend, who had to pass the message on via Facebook because she and Sarah weren't working together anymore. She said Sarah saw the message and then blocked her without so much as a word in reply. Obviously, the big question on everyone's lips was, how the hell did Sarah get into your flat that night? While I have a theory on that, towards the end of our relationship, I'd say the final 2 months or so, I gave Sarah the spare key to my flat. The letting agency had given me 2 copies of the key, one to keep as a spare, but I ended up giving it to Sarah so she could let herself into the flat when I wasn't around. Sometimes she'd finished work earlier than I did, so instead of having to take the tube all the way back to Wapping, Sarah used to just let herself into my flat and wait for me there. She gave me that spare key back when we exchanged stuff, and at the time, the thought did flash in my mind that she might have made a copy. But then, after weeks went by and there were no signs of any unwelcome intrusions, I decided that I had just been a little bit paranoid. Sarah was intense, but I didn't think she was make a copy of my flat key. Kind of intense. Yet, as events showed, I might have been a bit too generous. On that front, there's always a chance that I neglected to shut my front door properly, and that Sarah just so happened to pop around at a time when I just so happened to have failed to properly secure my flat, or this is the one that truly scares me, she made a copy of my key, waited a little while, and then decided that she was going to sneak into my flat in the middle of the night and hurt me. Granted, I didn't see any knife or hammer in her hand. All she did was apologize before running out of my flat. But if she wanted to talk, there's a dozen different ways that she could have reached out. She most certainly didn't have to sneak into my flat in the middle of the night and then creep into my bedroom while I was dead to the world. The only reasons that she'd want to do that is to catch me unawares, and the only logical reason she'd want to catch me unawares is because she wanted to hurt me. I moved away from London just before the pandemic, so I'm confident that she and I will never cross paths again, but if we did, let's just say that I wouldn't be in a rush to grab a coffee with her anytime soon.